Good evening. I welcome all of you to the 59th lecture of webinar series of Archaeological Sciences Center, IIT Gandhinagar. So we have been, as many of you might be knowing, we have been hosting this webinar series since 2020 October, and we'll be completing our 5 years of journey next month. So today we have with us Professor Mark Lycett, and next month we'll be having Professor Kathy Morrison. So both of them they'll be talking about their reinvestigation of one of the most important sites of South India, Brahmagiri. I welcome Professor Mark Lycett. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us and sparing your valuable time in the midst of your field work. And I really thank you on behalf of IIT Gandhinagar and Archaeological Sciences Center, IIT Gandhinagar. Before you begin your talk, I would request Unka to introduce you. So after that introduction, you can start it. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Lycett, Practice Professor of Anthropology and Director of the South Asia Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Lycett is an archaeologist and environmental historian whose research spans South Asia and the Spanish colonial Americas. He currently co-directs the South India Landscape Trajectories Project in collaboration with Kathleen Morrison and the Archaeological Survey of India. His earlier work includes the Vijayanagara Metropolitan Survey, as well as extensive studies on forest ecology, biodiversity, and the cultural construction of the landscape. Prior to Pennsylvania, Dr. Lycett held several key positions at the University of Chicago, including Director of the Program on the Global Environment and the Center for International Studies, and Academic Director of the South Asian Civilization Quarter abroad in Pune. The title of today's talk is Brahmagiri Legacies and New Directions, History, Historiography, and Research Design. Before we begin, I would like to express our gratitude to Dr. Lycett for taking the time to be with us today, sir. And so you may begin with your slides, sir.
Thank you for that generous introduction. And greetings to everyone from Brahmagiri, where we have just this very day completed our field season. So first, I want to be clear that this is a collaborative project. And what I have to present today is every bit as much a contribution of Kathy Morrison, our collaborators at ASI, our collaborators at the University of Pennsylvania, and many students and professionals from Indian institutions that make up our team. And you can see some of them here. Second, as the subtitle to the talk suggests, well, some of you might have noticed it, says part 1, right? This is only the first part of our presentation on our research at the site. Kathy will be following up next month with details of our work since 2023 and some of our most important results. I'm just warming up to her. Press her presentation of our results by asking 2 kinds of questions. The first question is, why has Brahmagiri been so important in the archaeology of southern India? And the second question is, why is it important now? Especially to us, in the context of our ongoing long-term research in northern Karnataka, which is now stretching to a 40-year period. Okay. For those who might be less familiar with the region, I'm not quite sure where Brahmagiri is. The Brahmagiri site is named after the hillock on and around which it's situated. It encompasses the early historic town of Asila and the medieval city of Hanea, and it's located on the northeastern boundary of Chitradurg district in northern Karnataka, right on the Karnataka-Andhra border. Okay. Now, to address these 2 questions that I raised, I've organized my discussion into what I think are 3 complementary parts. 3-part I expect will feed into one another as we make our way through the presentation this evening. Okay. The first of these I've labeled historiography. Right. And what I mean by this is the history of research, the history of archaeological and ethnographical research, but particularly how that research has shaped the questions we ask and the kind of understanding we can have of the past, right? How is the way that we've studied the site directed our understanding of the site? And particularly, how have we inherited a legacy of knowledge from our predecessors? Okay. The second topic I want to focus on is the history of Brahmagiri in itself, right? The occupational history of the site, or its history of being a place, right? Including the lived experience and everyday practices of the inhabitants and the ways in which they made their landscape over the past 5,000 years, right? Finally, I want to address our work and how Brahmagiri fits into the kinds of questions that we ask. What do we expect to learn from this work? What are the theoretical, the methodological, the substantive questions that motivate us to work here, right? So why has Brahmagiri been important in a couple of senses? And why is it important in the context of research that's happening right now and questions that we're asking right now? Okay. All right, let's start with the historiography bit. Okay, and I very much want to frame this discussion as a way of thinking about how archaeologists create knowledge of the past and how legacies of our prior work influence our understanding today. What is it possible to know with the tools and the inherited knowledge that we possess? In these terms, the history of research isn't just a review of what we know, but it's also an inquiry into how we know and how we can know. And Brahmagiri has figured really importantly in this process for archaeology, especially in South India. Brahmagiri is an iconic site. Every archaeologist working in South Asia should know, or at least have heard of, Brahmagiri at some point. And it's figured really, really crucially in two important projects of knowledge production for South India, one based in documentary sources and the other in archaeological research. Okay. Now, I want to do one more thing before I talk about those two research programs, and that's to talk about this map. This is probably the most famous, widely known map of Brahmagiri, right? So any student of the archaeological literature would be forgiven for thinking that Brahmagiri looks like this, that this is the whole thing or just about the whole thing. This is the mapped portion published by Mortimer Wheeler's in his 1947 excavations. It's a well-delimited and tractable region of the site, right? But in fact, Brahmagiri looks kind of more like this. It is a vast, sprawling, complicated landscape with multiple overlapping occupations on and around the hill and its environs. Its extent is more like the red dotted line than it is the red box indicating Wheeler's mapped area. Wheeler only talks about a very, very tiny portion of the overall site. So coming to terms with the complexity and understanding the spatial structure of the occupational history are really, really crucial to our project, right? Looking at the area that's well beyond the 1947 study area, okay? More immediately, though, we can address our knowledge of this vast site and why it's been so dominated by one little portion of it, okay? And we'll get to that in a minute. First, I want to show you a timeline of the history of research at the site. You can see it goes back to the 1890s, right, to the epigraphical work of Rice, which I'll mention again in a moment, the work of the Mysore State Department, starting in 1929 and extending all the way to 1947, right? The very famous excavations of the ASI in 1947, and some more recent work by Kathy on the collections from Wheeler's excavations at Brahmagiri in between 2000 and 2005, and our own work in 2014 on paleo environments that included Brahmagiri, as well as our more recent work split there by Arjun Rao's very valuable survey information from the area around Brahmagiri. And I don't want to fail to mention, as you see in parentheses at the bottom of the slide, the number of other projects working primarily, there's some excavation in there, but working primarily on very small portions of the site or on surface materials that have taken place since the 1950s and right up to the today. Let's see. All right. Brahmagiri first rose to scholarly prominence with the publication of the minor, or the publication of three, minor Ashokan rock edicts by B.L. Rice in 1892. Okay. Rice was born in Bangalore, was a lifelong student of language and epigraphy, and directed the epigraphical office at Mysore State. Between 1886 and 1905, Rice oversaw the collection and the translation of over 9,000 inscriptions, and these were published as the first 12 volumes of Epigraphia Karnataka, which was a massive, massive project. Right? Every kind of inscription that had been collected by colonial officials, that had been collected by agents of the Mysore State, and that was collected by Rice and the people who worked for Rice, went into these volumes. And it had a purpose, right? It was designed not just to collect information, but to provide a history for Karnataka, to extend a particular notion of what constituted history further into the text, right? Using the inscription database. Okay. And many scholars, including Kathy and I, have written about the ways in which inscriptions as a genre of elite representation and practice influence the kinds of histories that can be produced, right? But these methodological issues aside, that's something for another day. These issues aside, Epigraphia Karnataka is an absolutely monumental scholarly achievement, and it remains a crucially important resource today for anybody working on later time periods in this region. What I want to highlight, however, and before I do that, right, I just want to look at this quote that I pulled from Rice, right, where he talks about the present discovery, by which he means the three Ashokan minor rock edicts that occur in our study area, right, as bringing the South, bringing Karnataka into history, right, of having history for the very first time because of the presence of these inscriptions. Okay. And this is a map showing the distribution of Ashokan edicts, and I've kind of popped out the minor rock edicts, and particularly the three in the red circle. But those three rock edicts, the edict at Brahmagiri, then very closely nearby, edict at Siddhapura, and about 4 kilometers away at Jatinga-Rameshwara, those edicts have shaped all of the subsequent research at Brahmagiri in really, really important ways. These are the southernmost expression of Mauryan presence in the subcontinent. And again, for Rice, this was the moment when South India entered history, right? Becoming legible for the very first time from the perspective of a textual scholar. That sense of a region's history as defined in relation to texts is long-standing and consequential in South Asia's historiography. And for our purposes today, it's also crucially important to the next steps in Brahmagiri's research history. Okay. Nope. All right. And so let's go to some of those next steps. Right. For the archaeologist, the presence of a known historical marker, that is the edict, right, created the conditions of possibility for producing a cultural historical sequence fixed to an absolute chronology. In the era prior to radiocarbon dating and other methods we routinely rely on, archaeologists understood time through developmental stratigraphic sequences and through the direct historical approach, moving from the known, that is, the early historic, the time of Ashoka, to the unknown, to those time periods which occurred before written records existed in this area. And this movement moves through a series of periods defined by clusters of artifacts that occur together regularly, and particularly that could occur together regularly over broad regions, right? It's exactly this kind of project that motivated the next stage of research at Brahmagiri, right? So the edicts play directly into the archaeological research. Okay. The presence of the edicts first drew the Mysore State Archaeology Department under M.H. Krishna to work at Brahmagiri in 1929 in a project that had multiple field seasons at both Brahmagiri and Chandra Valley over the next 18 years. And the results of Krishna's work established a continuous cultural historical framework that extended from the late medieval period to what he called the Mesolithic Ropa culture. Krishna described the features and assemblages associated with each period in great detail, but he didn't really classify ceramic types as such. He described the ceramics as they occurred in the strata, but didn't really assign them types as we would understand types today. He also described the construction and the assemblages, the megaliths, and he associated them with both the Iron Age and the early historic settlement. His conclusions suggest the first synthetic outline for the prehistory region. Notably, Krishna's work was the first to consider the whole of Brahmagiri's archaeological sequence and spatial extent, right? And you can see from this map, published by Mysore State in 1934, right, that it doesn't just cover a small area, but covers the outcrop more broadly. with a number of the features of the medieval city, as well as the features of the earlier time periods, the early historic, the Iron Age, the Neolithic, also being included on the map. There are many features that Mysore State didn't include. There are some that are not mapped completely accurately, but particularly for something that was done in the 1930s on a very complex landscape. This is a wonderful map, and we've redocumented all of the features on it that could be relocated. Okay. Now, this is probably what you've been waiting for in terms of the history of the study. And that's Wheeler's work in 1947. That was certainly the most significant work at the site to date, conducted by the Archaeological Survey of India in 1947, along with a little bit of work by Mysore State at that same time. And this work very much built directly on Krishna's precedent, right? It worked in the same area using many elements of the same elements of research design. It did research both at Brahmagiri and Chandravali at the same time, seeing them as two key sites for the history of the region. And this work is particularly notable for both establishing the canonical chronology of Southern Indian prehistory and is a training ground for the first post-independence generation of Indian archaeologists. And when we look at the students at the Brahmagiri excavation, we see the leaders of archaeology in India for generations to come. And so a lot of people learned how to do archaeology, or at least a particular kind of archaeology, right? Working with Wheeler at Brahmagiri and other sites, right? So it's a tremendously influential excavation. Okay. Wheeler sought to establish a definitive chronological sequence and a regional synthesis by working from a historic framework provided by the edicts and cross-dating of artifacts from early historic sites, right, to the stratigraphic sequence of prior cultures. And Kathy has written about this in talking about our collections work, and so I'm just going to quote from Kathy's work here. But Wheeler's work produced more than simple temporal sequences. Instead, he constructed new ceramic-based cultural historical categories, which were seen to simultaneously encode time, ceramic variation, and ethnic biological distinction that later glossed as peoples. These categories still constitute the primary analytical units of South Indian prehistory. And there is the gentleman himself, and the iconic section drawing of BR21, one of the excavations from the site, that I'll discuss it again in just a moment, right? And I want to show you this. These are some of the excavation of megaliths, along with the trenches or stratigraphic excavations. Wheeler also excavated a number of the megaliths. Okay. And he was particularly interested in what he called the megalithic problem. What was the megalithic problem? The problem was the cultural and chronological associations of megalithic burials in this region, right? Because the burials have ceramics associated, often in very particular kinds of ceramics associated with them, but they're not in a kind of stratigraphic context, and they're often not. They're certainly not in, but they're often not even close to settlements. So how do we date the megaliths using this kind of developmental sequence, right, that Wheeler is building. Okay. So Brahmagiri offered a really useful place for this project because it had both a dated early historic residential component and abundant megaliths, right? So it was a good place to work backward from the early historic to find the sequence of pottery types associated with earlier time periods and compare that directly with the kinds of materials that occurred within the megaliths. So that was a big focus of what Wheeler was trying to accomplish. Two things, really. One, developing the basic cultural historical framework. And second, asking how the megaliths fit into that framework. Right? Here's this is just a table of Wheeler's excavation units from Brahmagiri. And I just want to note a couple of things about here, because there are certain obstacles that Wheeler faced in doing this twin project of his. First, the Iron Age, or what he called the megalithic, is not particularly well represented in the residential occupation of the site. Right? Where the Neolithic and the early historic occupations are much larger, much more widespread, and much more intensive. And you can see that Iron Age deposits were identified in Wheeler's excavations only in 3 of his trenches, which are all side by side. And it's only really in BR 21 that he found that very good stratigraphic sequence that he published. Okay. And there's a second thing, right? It's some kind of challenge here. And that's that the stratigraphic sequence, as it's represented here in the iconic profile of BR21, shows complete overlap in periods as they're defined by ceramic assemblages. That is, if we look at the megalithic culture there, right, we'll see that the megalithic culture overlaps with the stone axe culture, or the Neolithic. And it also overlaps with the Anthropology, right, or what we would call the early historic, right? There's no place where the megalithic culture occurs by itself. Right? So the Iron Age is more defined here by the absence of other wares, ceramic wares, than by the presence of its diagnostic type, which is black and red ware. Okay. So while Wheeler's work was foundational in the establishment of cultural and chronological sequences and characterization of megalithic and ceramic variation, right, it also has some questions that we still have about it. And it was quite narrowly focused. It excluded important areas of the site and later time periods. There is medieval material, right, where Wheeler was working, but he paid no attention to it whatsoever. He doesn't mention any medieval levels or cultural material as part of the site at all, despite its presence, even in the part of the site that he was working on. Right? There's no discussion at all of middle period occupation. So Brahmagiri, right, as it comes to us, and as it is represented in literature, is quite justifiably iconic. Right? There's no question that Rice's work, there's no question that Krishna's work, there's no question that Wheeler's work were extremely important, foundational to knowledge production about the past of this region, right? But there are limitations to what we know and what we can know, right, on the basis of the kind of work that's been done so far at Brahmagiri, right? About what comes down to us, right? And yeah, I want to talk about that in terms of the second question I want to raise, a second part, the history part, right? And here I'm asking, why is Brahmagiri itself important? Not just the way it's been studied, but the history, the occupational history, particularly of this study. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And these are just some of the kinds of things that are important about Brahmagiri, and I'll bring these up again at the end of this section. But it has a very long history, and a very long history of farming and herding in this semi-arid environment. It allows us to address a wide variety of questions. It has a very, very large, and a very, very complex series of Neolithic deposits, as well as an enormous number of megaliths. And it's also an example of early urbanization in this part of South India. The medieval city of India is a very big place. And it's a big place at a time when there weren't that many other big places in this region. And for us, it's also an opportunity to train a new generation of students in advanced methods, in methods that wouldn't have been available in Wheeler's time. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of overview of some elements of the site over the past 5,000 years of its occupational history. And here's a periodization that we often use with the Neolithic, giving way to the Iron Age, the early historic. And then it gets a little fuzzy there in the later, what's the difference between the later early historic and the early medieval, followed by what we can think of as the late medieval or pre-colonial Vijayanagara period leading into the Nayaka period. Okay. But briefly, and here's some of it, briefly, evidence of Neolithic occupation at Brahmagiri is extensive, and it's also quite deep, and it dominates the stratigraphic sequence in all of the excavations on the eastern side of the outcrop. At Brahmagiri, Neolithic settlement occurs with ashbale deposits, something you will hear a lot more about in Kathy's talk next month. But here you can see this is a section that we did of a cut made by a farmer's ditch. And you can see in the upper part of that section, you see a stratum of small cobbles. That's part of an extensive terrace system, which runs all the way up the hill slope. And below that, you see the beginnings of an ash mound deposit with a good 2 meters of ash mound deposit in that area. Okay. The Southern Neolithic in this region is succeeded by the Iron Age. And this is the period that was the primary focus of Wheeler's work at the site. The largest body of research on this period is on megalithic mortuary monuments, right? Like these, like the ones that have been documented at Brahmagiri and elsewhere. And it's quite remarkable when we read the early descriptions of the Brahmagiri site, right? In part because there are descriptions of hundreds of megaliths. There are descriptions of megaliths covering a broad area where we can no longer see them on the surface today, right? But only a small fraction of the megaliths here have ever been documented. Most intensively during Wheeler's work, right? But he only looked at a couple of small areas where he felt there were a sufficient number of intact megaliths to justify excavation. And so there are a lot of megaliths out there that we know a lot less about. Okay. And there is a drone image from our work in 2023 showing another area. This is an area surrounded by fields and some area that's being actively converted into fields, showing some of the remnants of the many, many megaliths that once dotted that landscape. Okay. The early historic of this region is based fundamentally on the appearance of Ashokan rock edicts in northern Karnataka and northwest Andhra Pradesh. While institutionalized religions and writing systems and imperial projects, new forms of social differentiation, rice agriculture, and novel artifacts characterize the early historic as it is derived from northern precedents. Iron production, some forms of millet farming, cattle domestication, and megalith building are all recognized as South Indian practices. Some sites in northern Karnataka show evidence of those northern precedents, sites like Sonati, but others, including Brahmagiri, remain very local in character, right, with the addition of edicts and a small number of artifacts that are characteristic of large-scale networks of circulation, things that link us to larger trade networks, that link us to larger polities. Now, the transition from the early historic to the middle period for this region is, to put it mildly, understudied. In South Asia, prehistory and history have often been treated as separate fields of study, with the scientific methods of prehistory absent in historical excavations. Certainly, we aim to overcome or erase this distinction in our work, treating the last 5,000 years of history in northern Karnataka as a single trajectory of change, or a series of multiple trajectories of change, but not greatly differentiating how we approach historic and prehistoric. Okay. The medieval in this period, or in this area, is largely known from 11th to 16th century inscriptions. And it's not at all clear how the earlier occupations here relate to the medieval. Is there continuous occupation? Is there a hiatus in occupation? This is something we expect our excavations, our research to address. And again, this is something Kathy will likely talk about in the next installment. Right? Middle period materials from the site of Hanea dominate the upper portions of Brahmagiri Hill and the western plain of Brahmagiri extending towards the Siddhapura Reservoir. They're also quite common on the eastern slope, where we find the megaliths and the early historic material, where there was a medieval period road that stretched the length of the outcrop. And we find roadside associated features, especially in the Vijayanagara period, all along that roadway as it traverses the east side of the outcrop. And just a few images. This is, you're seeing images from our mapping of the site, as well as an image of one of the temples at the site. These are images from on top of the outcrop, some of the things that are on the hill itself, including a medieval roadway, a temple complex and settlement area, And here we just see that same base map that I showed you earlier, but with the green circle indicating the size of Enea by about the 13th century, right, which was likely the height of occupation of the site. So it became very large, very complicated, with massive architecture of various sorts by the 13th century. All right. So as a sequence then, right, we've inherited well-defined periods, but well-defined periods with less attention to their internal variation. There are moments of rupture and discontinuity. From our perspective, it's important to understand how those practices of landscape construction vary over time and how they create different kinds of ecologies, different kinds of historical ecologies, different kinds of political ecologies, right? And this returns us to why Brahmagiri is important to us, right? As part of our long-term work in the region. What are the properties of Brahmagiri, right, that have brought us to reconsider it, right, to revisit it? Certainly its long history of occupation, right, but especially an opportunity to address certain kinds of questions that have animated our research for a long time. And particularly to look at something, right, which is an important and valuable contrast to the work that we've done earlier, right? And that brings us to why Brahmagiri is important to our research, design. And in our current project, entitled South Indian Landscape Trajectories, known locally as SILT, integrates previous research at Brahmagiri as well as a comparative sequence at the successive settlements of Karnataka, Anagundi, and Vijayanagar. Okay. And it particularly has a focus on long-term and variable human-environment relationships, right? So Brahmagiri, with its own trajectory of agrarian and settlement history, forms one part of that equation. An equation that asks not how sequences are alike across this region, but how and why they vary. Right? Here we have to zoom out for a moment. Okay. Thanks to the last 3 decades of research, we now have multiple well-studied long-term sequences in this region, including at sites like Noski and Tekalakota, Karibakale and Vijayanagar, Sambankalu, and Brahmagiri Enea, right? And we've worked at 2 of these 3 sites, and which you can see circled in red on that map, right? That's what forms the basis of our comparison. So in a sense, then, what we're working on is a tale of 2 landscapes, right? Or a trajectory of 2 landscapes. The landscape around Vijayanagar, which also includes the earlier settlements of Karibakale and Anagundi, right? And the landscape around Brahmagiri, which also includes the Sila and the medieval city of Enea. Right? Okay, so why is this comparison so important to us? Why is it so apt? Okay. Here's a slide that I know Kathy's going to be really amused that I use this slide, because this is very much a Kathy thing. I would not necessarily choose this form of representation, but I think it works really, really well for making this claim, right? So on the top, we have a kind of cartoon version of the historical trajectory of settlement at Karibakale, Anagundi, Vijayanagar, right? Moving from a small Neolithic and Archaeological settlement an early historic settlement, into an enormous late medieval settlement with some thin areas, if not outright gaps, like during some of those time periods. On the other hand, on the Isila and Brahmagiri side, we have a much larger Neolithic occupation. Real questions about the size and the extent of the Iron Age occupation, and a large and long-lived, extensive medieval occupation. It never gets as big as Vijayanagara does, but few things really do, right? But it's big enough. It's certainly big. So here we have these two contrasting kinds of histories, right, of settlement. But they're also contrasted in other important ways, right? And that's a contrast between wet and dry. Vijayanagara is on the Tungabhadra River and has access to a permanent water source. Irrigation is important at Vijayanagara from a very early time period, right? And wet rice agriculture probably has a much longer history, and wet agriculture has a much longer history, even predating the city of Vijayanagara in that region. It is an area where agriculture used irrigation early, and where irrigation was expanded to its limits in various different ways over the 200-year period of occupation of Vijayanagara, as Kathy's work is amply documented, right? Brahmagiri is not like that. Brahmagiri is not on a permanent water source. The Chinahagiri River, associated with Brahmagiri, is seasonal in its water flow. It is significantly more arid. It is significantly more reliant on rainfall and runoff harvesting for any kind of agricultural production. So now we have a contrast in settlement history. We have a contrast in hydrology and climate, and we have a contrast in agrarian possibility and agrarian history animating this comparison. Okay. So our object is to complement reconstructions of past environments in the dry interior region of Karnataka from about 3000 BCE to the present, with data on settlement history, land use change, farming, food, social organization, cities, and households. Overall, right, our plan is to systematically compare these two attributes of change in and around Karnataka and in and around Brahmagiri Hinaya, right? Where farming, where urbanization took a very different form and operated at a different scale and at a different tempo than it did in the Karnataka region. Right? Our goals are to link reconstructions of past vegetation, fire history, woody cover crops and field weeds, and with charred plant remains, with animal bones, artifacts, and other indicators of farming practices, food processing, storage, and exchange, and to better understand animal use and environmental and social impacts. To also explore changing lifeways in both a rain-fed region and an irrigated region within a similar but not identical semi-arid landscape, and also to document changes in settlement organization and layout, to attempt to understand periods of social differentiation and increase in social differentiation, in specialization through time, as well as to explore the connections of rural farmers with larger cities and states. We also seek to link the prehistoric and historic records of North Karnataka using analytical methods usually reserved for prehistoric sites on sites of all periods in the region. Finally, we want to establish a training ground, as we've said, for students from India, from the US, from other countries, right? That includes up-to-date methods for mapping, surface documentation, small-scale excavation, and a range of analytical methods. And to do this, right, we've developed a multi-stage research design in order to look at the variations in land use and the variations in the multiple forms of urbanism that we see, right, in this landscape. Yeah. All right. So phase one, right, is really something that's ongoing, but started in 2023. This is particularly about spatial control, about surface documentation, about incorporating all the previous research that's been done at the site. And this is particularly important in a complex landscape where it would be very, very difficult to map something like this using conventional methods, particularly conventional methods that required a line of sight in order to complete the mapping. Here you can see the orthophoto map, which we developed from our digital elevation model. This is based on drone mapping of the site. And it's not just a photograph. It kind of looks like a photograph. Here we see the site grid superimposed over it. But we can zoom in to anywhere on the map with 2-centimeter accuracy, right? It gives us tremendous flexibility and tremendous spatial control, and it's something that we were able to accomplish in a single field season, which just seems like a miracle to me, and is very, very different from the kinds of mapping systems that I was trained on back in the Pleistocene. Okay. Using these kinds of methods, much of the site has been documented for the first time in the last couple of years, and that's despite the long history of research. And just to give you a flavor for some of those kinds of things, here you can see our postdoctoral researcher, Dr. Chad Hill, an expert in digital archaeology, flying the drone. He's in the red hat. And you can see the results of the drone mapping of that particular temple complex and its sister temple right next to it. Here we can also, I'm also going to show you some of the other kinds of things we've been doing as this part of this phase, including resistivity mapping and a specialized kind of resistivity mapping called ERT mapping. That's been particularly helpful in locating buried features, particularly diffuse buried features like ash minerals, right, which present problems for other kinds of remote sensing. Okay. The next phase, which is where we are today, began in January of this year, and will continue in our next field season, is our test excavations, right? Excavations that emphasize the diverse parts of the site by sampling across a series of regions using relatively small excavation units, where we are able to see something of the stratigraphy and to characterize different areas of the site, as well as to get some radiometric dates and samples for further analysis, especially, here's the location of all the test units we've excavated this year. In the next phase, we'll move on top of the animal crop, where we will excavate a series of test excavations in the deposits up there. I especially want to emphasize, though, the laboratory analyses. and analytical studies that are emerging from this work, because we could not address the questions we want to address if we weren't doing all of these things. And I especially want to highlight the work of our colleagues and students in this regard. So you can see, here's Kathy taking some samples from an excavation at Brahmagiri, taking a column sample of propellant and sediment analysis. But we're also looking at a number of other different kinds of analytical methods for talking about both environment and land use in the past. And again, just these are some of the kinds of things that we are looking at systematically across the range of excavations from the site, including pollen phytoliths and geochemical analysis, chartfall, land macrofossils, and fauna, and then stabilizers analysis. And what's next? Right? Will not happen for a couple of years, but in phase 3, we hope to open some broader scale horizontal exposure of selected occupational contexts from different time periods and within different parts of the site, as well as to expand our surface documentation through surface survey to a broader region around the site. Right? Okay. Now, in conclusion, very close to conclusion, right? I hope that I've partially answered the question of how and why Brahmagiri is important. Certainly, it's played a central role in a number of ambitious scholarly projects over the past century plus. The methodological and substantive legacies of work by Rice, by Krishna, by Milan should not be underestimated, right? But Brahmagiri's importance is not solely based on the fame of its previous excavators. The scale, the sequence, the tempo of landscape production here stands in contrast to other sites in the region, and notably in our case, Karnataka and Vijayanagara. And it's important in its own right, for its own history of human experience, practice, and placemaking. Finally, it's important to the questions we ask of the past and our contemporary forms of archaeological knowledge production as we investigate how lives and landscapes are intertwined in trajectories of difference and transformation. Our hope is that this talk will serve as a preference and perhaps a lure to revisit Brahmagiri again next month as Kathy discusses our findings thus far and lays out our future directions in more detail. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk and giving insights of your project. I have a few questions. How long is this project?
Oh, well, we conceive of it as something which is likely to last about 5 years, 5 active field season years. So we're 2 years into what we expect to be a 5-year project.
Okay. One more question coming to my mind is the settlement pattern in this region. Right? I mean, do you have a wider area to explore to understand the settlement pattern of different time periods?
Yes. I think that putting together the work that's been done in this region, in the area around Vijayanagara, through the Vijayanagara and Metropolitan Survey, in the area around Bengal, where there's been a regional survey, around the site of Muskie, around the site of Tekalakota, and some of the other, some of the other sites in the region, it's letting us start to build up that kind of regional sediment pattern history, to recognize that there is a variation in trajectories within this, this region, and to begin to talk about what's structuring those differences.
Last question from my side. Do you have any plans to also understand the economic trade relations or exploitation of various raw materials in the particular time period? Do you have already
Absolutely.
database of raw material resources in this depth?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Our focus tends to be on the landscape, right? On land use, because that's where Kathy and I have our greatest interest. But yeah, we will absolutely be working on the sets of connections, right? As evidenced by trade, the forms of production at the site, and the ways in which these are entering larger kinds of systems of circulation across South Asia and beyond. That is a very important component anytime we're talking about time periods like the early historic and medieval, but also as it may pertain to earlier periods when material is moving around.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you once again for this wonderful talk. Sharva, can take over for the Q&A.
Yeah, so I can see one question in the Q&A box and a few in the chat box. I'm going to read them out.
Okay.
Avoid duplication and irrelevant ones. So the first one is by Ankitesh Tiwari, who asks, who thanks you for the lecture, firstly, and then asks, Sir Mortimer Wheeler's 1947 excavation at Brahmagiri established the cultural sequence that has dominated South Indian archaeology for decades. In your new research, which specific aspects of Wheeler's methodology or interpretations do you find most in need of critical revision? And which parts of his legacy do you believe still hold value?
That's a really good question, right? Because I mean, it's always the case, right, that we're going to find issues with previous research, with ideas that we had that turned out to be wrong, right? So I don't want to be hypercritical of our predecessors. This is really foundational pioneering work. But there are things which Wheeler may have missed, and this is something I think Kathy will talk about next time. There are features that he didn't necessarily see in the work that he did. But I think more importantly, it's the way in which culture history as a perspective on how to do archaeology focuses our attention on particular kinds of things, like including on the construction of periods, on the conflation of period and culture and people very often, and on pushing us away from seeing variability and seeing transition. So I would prefer to say not that I'm rejecting the work of Wheeler so much as there are things that I want to know that I don't think I can learn in a purely cultural historical framework, right? And that's what I think is in need of rethinking.
Sorry, I was muted. The same participant has a follow-up question. A key challenge at Brahmagiri has been refining its chronology, particularly the transition between Neolithic to Chalcolithic and the Iron Age. Does your new research design include a strategy for obtaining a more robust series of absolute dates through, for example, AMS dating? And are you hoping to resolve specific chronological debates with this new data?
Oh, yes. So, yes, we will be using AMS dating. We will also be using conventional radiocarbon dating where that's more appropriate to the samples. Our work is very geared towards obtaining a large number of stratigraphic samples for chronological purposes. It's one of the reasons why we've done things like not just draw the section, but take samples from the ash mound you saw cut by a farmer's ditch, and why we are excavating where we are in the way that we are, to help us gain a better sense of the absolute chronology of the site and how it's related to the archaeological chronology defined by those time periods and their association with particular forms of ceramics and other materials. Right. So we are very focused on sequences of datable material from stratigraphic contexts in our work at the site.
Okay, the next question is by Professor Cherry. He asks, will it be more appropriate to use the term urbanization process that is starting from 300 BC from the mature Iron Age culture? To you, it is starting from 1200 BC, avoiding altogether the term and implications of megalithic culture. That is, iron metallurgy could be the single major factor that transformed the society into more organized ways of living. So the society continued their mortuary practices with their pre-Iron Age affection to stone, as reflected in more sophisticated ways with the presence of fine artifacts.
So, there are a couple of kinds of things going on here. One is the term urbanization, which I'm not at all wed into as an important term. I think what we are seeing is a sequence in which we see larger and larger concentrations of people. If we want to use the term urbanization or urbanization process for that, or if there's another term that people prefer, what's important to me is that process is happening. Right, we are seeing a process of larger, more concentrated settlement occurring in the region around Brahmagiri, starting sometime in the Iron Age, very early historic, right? And something that continues through about the 14th century or so, perhaps with gaps in between. And we want to know about how that's happening, why that's happening. Why is it happening here when it isn't happening in the same way at other places within the region? Those are the things that are framing our questions about this process that we might call urbanization, that has to do with the concentration of sediment. And then all of the things that implies for how it is people live, how things people use their landscapes, how it is people relate to one another within these kinds of settings. Now, the second part of that was a question about iron. Right?
Yeah, iron technology.
Right. So, what's the social role of iron technology? That's a good question, right? And I think it's an important question. And I also want to know, or we want to know, what's the extent of iron production, of iron technology, right? Of iron use at the site. We certainly have evidence of iron from a range of time periods at the site. We thus far don't have definitive evidence of iron production at the site, although certainly iron ores are available in the Sandur Hills, which are not very far from Brahmagiri. And certainly we know that the Sandur Hills have been a focus of iron production since the Iron Age. The question of how people are participating in an iron production culture and what role that might have on some of the other ways in which they're organized socially, they're organized politically, they're organized economically. It's a really important question. Right? We're not quite sure what the role of iron is at Brahmagiri. And we're not quite sure what the role of iron might be in relation to the ways in which people relate to things like the mortuary monuments. But yeah, there are a lot of really basic questions that we have about things like the chronology of the mortuary monuments. They're dated entirely on the basis of cross-dating black and red ware ceramics. At this point, it would be wonderful to have more chronometric dates from monumental burial contexts from anywhere in South India. That would be very helpful.
I think that kind of answers one of the other questions where Deepak Pan has asked about which factors you would focus on, particularly to understand early urbanization. So I think we can kind of skip that question, right? Or do you want to add something to that?
Okay. No, I think, given what we know at the moment and what we're trying to learn, it's really about this process of how people come to live in these particular ways over a series of centuries.
Mm-hmm. So we can move to the next one?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so there are two questions from Shikha. The first one is, during the medieval period around 1200 CE, the other parts of the world, they were facing medieval warm periods, but in the Indian context, we see an intensification of monsoon cycles in the western coast and the adjoining regions. How much of this phenomenon has played a crucial role in the development of agrarian expansion in and around Brahmagiri region?
That's a kind of question that I think we'll have to wait for some of the microfossil analysis to come back. Well, we'll have to wait until we have well-developed vegetation sequences, right? The kinds of things we can learn from pollen, because those kinds of cycles should show up in the pollen. And it's at that point, I think, that we can talk about the ways in which shifts in rainfall patterns, to the extent that we can monitor shifts in rainfall patterns through proxy measures, right, are correlated with things that we see in the archaeological material, that we see in the settlement material, and can talk about, yes, these things seem to be at least temporally related, or not. Is the agrarian expansion within this region during a period that's particularly or unusually wet? Or does it precede that? Does it have to? These are, in many ways, these are still empirical questions until we have a more complete analytical record available to us.
Sharda, you're muted.
Sorry. The second question from the same participant is about the role of religion, that is local and the royal patronage, which have played an important role, as Andrew Bauer mentions in his paper, that during the medieval period in Karnataka region, the black soil type land, they were donated to temples which were more fertile, and the red soil type land were used by locals. So what do you have to say for that?
I think that for our region, right, we don't see a kind of sharp differentiation in soil types. A black soil versus red soil. That's something that we see further north in Karnataka, right, on the northern side of the Tungabhadra River. It would be easier to identify those differences. We don't have, for this region itself, the kind of inscriptional record that would be able to allow us to talk about differentiated land grants on the basis of the agricultural potential of the soil. I would suggest, and certainly our work on Vijayanagra bears this out, that religion is a crucial factor and a crucial medium of elite practice, right, and elite claim making during the medieval period. It's the forum in which elite status is built and expressed, particularly in terms of the economy of divination, the participation in the temple economy. So yeah, I think it's really, really important. I think we are likely, I think it was important at Hene. But in terms of seeing a kind of difference in the value of resources as these are expressed in a history of land grants, we don't have enough information to talk about that yet. So for our region.
Okay, I see one last question, which is about the Ashokan rock edicts, which are a defining feature of Brahmagiri. This question is from Ankitesh Tiwari. Does your research design incorporate specific strategies to archaeologically test the nature and extent of the Mauryan administrative presence on the ground beyond just the epigraphic evidence? For instance, are you looking for specific pottery forms or architectural styles or evidence of resource extraction?
Well, we would certainly welcome any evidence of Mauryan presence beyond the edicts, right? And I think it's an open question whether there's any kind of administrative presence within the region. The question of what are these minor rock edicts meant to do? What are they meant to express? Who is the audience that they're speaking to? Do they reflect a kind of local presence, right, of the Mauryan Empire? Or are they something different? Are they signposts along a road, for example? We're certainly open to investigating any kind of evidence of Mauryan presence that we find. We're certainly open to investigating any evidence of intensive exploitation of natural resources or shifts in the exploitation of resources within this region that occur in and around the early historic time period. Those are certainly things we will be looking at. I'm not sure that I think it's a category of evidence that is likely to be hard to find simply because it will not be abundant, right? Which means you need a much larger sample size to see it, even if it's there. I think that there are likely to be constraints on what we can learn about the Mauryan presence unless we happen to stumble across the head office of the Mauryan viceroy for a Sela or something like that. Yeah, so I think it's something we'd love to know about. We'd love to be able to offer evidence for. It's not something that's going to be easy to bring evidence to bear on.
Yeah, I think you've taken all the questions and they were all very interesting and relevant. So yeah. Prabhakar, we just wait for him to join. Okay, he's on the call. So we're almost done. We just want to wrap up the session.
Okay.
I see one more. Oh, somebody said thank you to you.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Yeah, and I certainly want to express my appreciation to everyone who tuned in on a Saturday afternoon and spend some time listening to this talk and is taking an interest in our work at Brahmagiri.
So I have one more question, if I may ask.
Sure.
Do you have any evidence of industrial activities? Industrial activities like iron smelting furnaces or iron smelting areas?
Funny you should ask, because just within the last couple of weeks, within a unit that is likely to be entirely in early historic deposits, we do have evidence of some kind of production of a furnace. That one isn't an iron furnace. It simply wasn't heated to a high enough temperature to have been used for iron. It was used for something else. It may have been part of a ceramic kiln, but at the base of that furnace, right, we did start to find the kinds of things that are associated with iron production. That is iron slag, iron ore, and slagged brick, which is typically what you would expect if iron furnaces are being built and taken apart, right? So the kinds of things that I've seen associated with iron production, for example, in the area around Vijayanagra, in some of the iron producing sites that are closer to the Sundar Hills, we're starting to get some things that might be indicative of that. I don't think we'll know if we have really full-fledged iron production going on until the next field season, when we're able to get a little bit deeper in that and similar units. But I would say that that's the best evidence we have right now of some kind of large-scale form of production at the site.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think we don't have any more questions, right? Okay, thank you so much, Professor Mark, for the wonderful talk. And I really wish the very best for you and your team for the future work. And this research hopefully it will bring out more aspects about the Brahmagiri. Thank you so much. And I thank all the participants for taking time to join this talk. I also thank Sharada, Unta, and my entire team for participating and helping support this. Thank you so much.